Claude Lévi-Strauss is one of the most important thinkers in 20th century French thought, and he's one of the founding members of Structuralism, an important contribution to social science and to the methodological connections between science that is, I think, most popular in 20th century France. Along with Jean Piaget and structuralist linguists like de Saussure and Jacobson, Lévi-Strauss attempts to find underlying regularities, what might be described as a sort of mathematical or logical rules that underlie human behavior. So what Lévi-Strauss is attempting to do, because he's an anthropologist, is to look at human behavior, human institutions, human customs, and try and find a deep, secret structure beneath the apparent surface structures, beneath the manifest content. In the most general sense, structuralism, as it's offered by Piaget and Lévi-Strauss, is the most important 20th century French variant of a sort of scientific stance towards the world. Positivism, empiricism, things like that have never been popular in French culture for reasons that are not especially clear to me. In the 20th century, those French thinkers who have had the greatest familiarity with and friendliness towards science have largely been attracted by structuralism. It is a logically rigorous method. It is in many respects a method which owes its origins to Descartes and Plato and the rationalist tradition in Western philosophy. And perhaps that's one reason, this Cartesian rationalistic element, which has always been so important in French culture, perhaps that's one reason why it seems to have gotten its greatest number of adherents in France. Now, you could say that this continues the tradition of Western idealism, not necessarily because it's committed to the Platonic or Cartesian ontologies, but rather because of their emphasis on logical structure, on logical rigor. Mathematics and algebra are important elements in structuralism. It is very much worth noting that in the early part of the 20th century, a group of mathematicians called the Bourbaki, who assigned themselves under the pseudonym Nicolas Bourbaki, developed what's called structuralist mathematics. In other words, a school of mathematical research, a program for research, which used the principles of structuralism to find new and important results in math. It is interesting that it works not only for math, but also there is a structuralist school of crystallography and mineralogy, which is very peculiar, because the idea of finding one common method which links math with things like geology and extrapolating from these operations and applying them to things like language or to things like kinship systems or to things like mythology is a great intellectual jump. The assumption that lies beneath this is that there's some sort of Urstoff, some sort of fundamental facts about human thinking and by implication about human consciousness that are the same everywhere. When you find these intrinsic structures to the mind, after finding these deep structural formations, what we look to do then is to connect these structures, structurally one might imagine, to find a larger structure. This large structure of structures will be the structure of human existence itself in a sort of logical algebraic form. So what we're trying to do is what Descartes tried to do in some ways, to reduce the booming, buzzing confusion of surface reality to one unchanging substratum, which is accessible equally to all rational minds. And the distinction between this homogeneous and static substratum and the empirical external booming, buzzing reality of the world will be a series of algebraic rules for transformation of one to the other. Let me give you an example. In nature, we assume that the natural world is composed of matter. Sensible enough. We all believe that. I think most of us do. And we also believe that there are certain rules, like F equals ma, or the various laws of thermodynamics, which tell us how matter gets transformed into the various appearances that it has. Gases and solids and liquids, oxidation and all the chemical processes. We assume that there's some substratum underneath these appearances, like burning and melting and freezing. It's all matter. The differences that we see at the level of appearances, we assume come from some sort of transformation. Our job as natural scientists is to discern these transformations and to work out mathematical formulae which will allow us to describe them in a neat and completely precise way. Think of the laws of Newtonian mechanics, things like F equals ma or E equals mc squared. It gets a vast variety of apparent change and reduces it to Parmenidean or Platonic unity. It stays where it is. So I hope that you can see then that there is a sort of Cartesian or Platonic goal to structuralism. They want to move it, though, they don't want to restrict it simply to the realm of nature, to the realm of physical reality or matter. They want to extend it to the whole world. And we'll make a sort of ontological assumption here, at least Lévi-Strauss does this in many cases, that the world of nature is physical, it's just material. The world of culture, the truly human world, is made up not of matter, although he doesn't deny that, he's not a dualist. It's made up of symbols. In other words, what it means to be human, what it means to be part of a consciousness, what it means to be part of a human community, because they all kind of coalesce concretely together, is that you are a set of symbols. In other words, the world around us is constructed by the symbols which we construct. And human beings construct their symbols according to certain structural laws. He has looked at various instantiations of symbolic behavior on the parts of human beings and tried to find underneath them a sort of deep structure which can be expressed in a quasi-mathematical way. All right? So that's basically the idea. It's something like the attempt to find mathematical truths within the empirical realities of, say, the physical world. Think of some examples. The best example and the kind of the lead-off point for structuralism is linguistics. The first and most important contributions that structuralist thinkers made were in the field of linguistics. And here's a funny, language is funny, and in some respects it's the perfect way to start a project like this. Because there's a sense, pretty clearly, that language exists in the empirical world. I'm on a podium now, or behind a podium, speaking to you. These are speech acts. And you can look at my speech acts or someone else's speech acts or a vast number of speech acts and try and derive from them certain rules, which we call the grammar and the syntax of English. And in fact, English does have a grammar and a syntax. And not only that, but the grammar and syntax of English is a kind of set of quasi-mathematical rules or logical rules for the construction of grammatical sentences. It is a different way of thinking about language, as opposed to an empirical study of language to look at how people actually talk. Right? We're thinking about it in two different ways. To look at language empirically, you would look for the content of what people are saying. When a structuralist looks at language structurally, he's looking for the form of what's going on here. So de Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, the greatest and first of the structuralist linguistics around the turn of the century, wrote a book called The Course in General Linguistics, which is kind of the founding text of structuralism. And what he says is, although empirical and historical linguistics has added something to our knowledge of language, it's fundamentally mistaken in the way it approaches language. Language is not a temporal series of activities, or at least not merely that. It is also an atemporal, static set of rules. So what we want to do when we investigate English is look at the way native speakers of English construct their sentences, not so much what they say. That's not nearly so important. And after doing that, when we find the structure of English and the structure of French and the structure of German, it may be possible for us then to structure the structures and to find some sort of structure that makes language possible. What Lévi-Strauss does is go beyond that. He says not only is it possible to look at human or at linguistic structures in this way, it's possible to look at the whole domain of human behavior in this way. In other words, it can all be seen as a set of rule-governed communicative structures. So what Lévi-Strauss ends up doing in his Anthropology is reading kinship systems, looking within kinship systems to see if there's some grammar by which they operate. And then from kinship systems, he goes to things like table manners, cuisine, what cultures will and will not eat, things like that. And he's trying to read them, to find within them a deep structure that adheres in all human beings, right? That's part of the human mind as human mind. So it's a very ambitious project. And in some respects, it has similarities to Freud and Marx. Freud and Marx are two of the great structuralist heroes. And if you understand why it is that structuralists like people like Freud and Marx, it'll make it clear, or it'll make it clearer later on what these guys are trying to do. Think about Freud. I just gave a lecture on him. And what we found out when we were dealing with Freud is that he made a distinction between the manifest content of people's statements and behavior and the real latent content, the unconscious content. And then he constructed a thing called the unconscious, which is a set of rules which allow us to translate from the manifest content to this deep submerged structure, which is the reality of the human psyche. Can you see why this is a sort of algebra by which we turn whatever our dreams, whatever the content of them is, into some regulated set of sexual desires? So in other words, as far as Freud is concerned, the content of your dream by itself doesn't really matter. We'll fish around to find out in your idiom what that particular set of symbols means. But he's not so much interested in the content of dreams as in the form and the structures by which we could translate these manifest contents into unconscious realities. Get the idea? Think about Marx. Same sort of thing is going on. Marx says, well, every society generates an ideology which legitimates the characteristic kind of exploitation in that society. All right? Well, what he's saying is that what you see then in, say, the 12th century in Western Europe, you see a set of ideas which say that God makes the king, and we have the great chain of being, and that's why you have to obey the king. That's the surface structure. What Marx says is that let me give you a series of transforms, a sort of algebraic algorithm which will allow you to go from any claim about the legitimacy of one particular society to the reality, which is exploitation. Can you see that we move from the surface to the deep structure? And that what both Marx and Freud are doing in different ways is trying to provide us something like a formal algorithm for moving from one to the other, regardless of the content. It's very mathematical, or very logical, perhaps that's a better way of putting it. But can you see how this is also quite abstract? In that respect, quite French, right, if you think of the Cartesian tradition. Okay. So this gives you some idea of what we're driving at in structuralism and what people are trying to get accomplished with this activity. Now, Piaget, the great French psychologist, is also a structuralist. He and Lévi-Strauss are probably the most important figures in this trend. And Piaget tells us, I mean, in a very nice little book, if those of you who are at home want a good introduction to structuralism, I recommend Piaget because it's lucid and it's small and restricted and it's very clear. And in his book, he says that structures have three properties. First of all, they're wholes. In other words, wholeness is a property of a structure. We might say that the grammar of the English language, that's a structure. The grammar of the English language plus all the contents of my junk drawer at home, you know, all the stuff that I happen to have in it, that's not a structure. That doesn't form a whole. So there's some idea of holistic integrity, which I don't think we should question too hard because I don't think it's terribly clear. But some things we assume to be wholes and some things we assume not to be. They have the property of unity, not a mere aggregation. The second property that a structure has is that it's transformable. In other words, if it were just a formal structure and was static, the problem is that we could never make that connect with our experience of the world, which is changeable. We have flux. Things move, change their location. They come into being and go out of being in the world of space and time. So we need some rules for the transformation of these static structures. And the rules for transformation and the generating of these rules is the goal of structuralism. And the final point that Piaget makes is that all structures are self-regulating. Mathematics, for example, is a structure. And we don't appeal to some other structure to find out if mathematics is true. If you want to find out if a certain set of mathematical utterances really is a proof, well, then the thing to do is to look at the mathematical canons of proof. We don't go to some other discipline to find out if mathematics is true. Similarly, in linguistics, if we were trying to describe the structure of the declarative sentence, we don't go to some other discipline, geography or mathematics or something, to find out if we're structuring it properly. We work within the canons of linguistics. Point here is that structuralism and all the treatments of structures within it is a sort of Spinozistic, self-contained whole. And that, again, links it up with this idealist Cartesian tradition. Another thing you should note is that this movement from wholeness and unity to transformation and then to self-regulation, in many respects is like Plato's divided line. Up in the realm of the forms, we have the structure, the whole, the unity, the things that stay the way they are. And then the transition from the top of the divided line to the bottom turns out to be these rules of transformation. All right? Make the analogy to our knowledge of nature. Matter is what's there. We have things like F equals ma, our rules for transformation of it, and thus we get the stuff on this side of the divided line, the booming, buzzing, changing confusion of the world around us. Right? So it definitely has a rationalistic Cartesian tendency to it. There is a tendency to try and drive everything into mathematical form. That's when we feel like, or that's when structuralism feels like we know what we're talking about. Now, the origins of it probably go back to Plato and the whole idealist tradition, but particularly Vico. Those of you who have read Vico's work will see in Vico an attempt to grasp these essential structures of the human mind and then historicize them. In Vico's view that we move from the age of the gods to the age of the heroes to the age of men and then we become decadent, what we see there is an attempt to say that the human mind is the same but transformed under different historical circumstances. What this is an algebra of that transformation. Right? And he says, look, every society does that. Rome did it, China did it, Babylon did it. The reason why they all work the same way is that there's a common Urstoff of the human mind that when faced with the same sort of transformations gives you the same sort of results. Right? It's a way of getting the deep structure of the psyche, but not at the Cartesian individual level. What Lévi-Strauss is going to try and do is find the deep structure of the psyche at the cultural collective level. All right, so we're going to move from the city to the man. Now, before I go on, I'd like to contrast this with the other tendencies in anthropology in the 20th century. Functionalism is the opposite of structuralism, not merely as a kind of wordplay, but in practice. Schools of anthropology, I mean, they're divided up in pretty much according to those lines in the middle of the 20th century. And these roughly correspond to the distinctions between Anglo-American anthropologists and continental anthropologists. it is very similar to the distinction between Kant and Hume. One school of thought is essentially empirical. That's what anthropological functionalism is. The other school of thought is essentially rationalistic and abstract and Cartesian. That is essentially what structural anthropology is. And you really get a sense of what structuralism and structural anthropology is if I compare Lévi-Strauss to Malinowski. Malinowski is probably the greatest of the functionalist anthropologists. Think of it this way. Suppose we look around the world and look at human behavior, and we find that if you go to Israel, the pig is unfit to eat. You can't eat a pig. But here, you can have a pig and it's not a problem. We go to India and you can't eat a cow. The cow is sacred there. You must not eat that. Here, if you go to a restaurant and you order dog, they will look at you very strangely and they will not serve you dog. Why? Because it's not a clean animal. Now, clearly, this is not something we derive from some sort of scientific activity. Right? These are our customs. And the customs of India are that they don't eat the cow, and in Israel, they don't eat the pig. Here's the question, or here's a way of formulating the question. Malinowski, the functionalist, is going to look at this. He's going to say, well, there must be some function being served by that particular animal in that particular society. So maybe the ancient Jews developed the Levitical code that you can't, tells you can't eat the pig because of those worms inside pork that maybe give you disease. So maybe it serves some function. In other words, Leviticus would be seen as the coding of some biologically useful function. The problem is that it doesn't seem to work all the time. In other words, what function does it serve in India, a place with chronic food shortages, that you can't eat cows? That doesn't make any obvious sense. And you have to reach really far to find a function that serves. And at a certain point, you begin to think, this is awfully fishy. How do you know that there's always a function being served here? Right? Can you see how this becomes less and less illuminating over time? Let's look at how Lévi-Strauss is going to look at that same problem and see how he reformulates the question in a completely different way. Lévi-Strauss would say, I'm not interested in the fact that pigs can't be eaten in Israel and dogs can't be eaten in America and cows can't be eaten in India. Who cares what the content of it is? I don't care about whether it's a pig or a cow or a dog or a parrot. Doesn't matter. What Lévi-Strauss is interested in is the category of the inedible. Why is it that cultures all over the world generate something that is clearly possible food that they won't let people eat? Doesn't make any obvious sense. It is, stop telling me that this serves some function. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. He says this category of the inedible, how does it relate to the category of things we are allowed to eat? What does that say about us? And is it put together according to certain rules? In other words, are there sets of rules transculturally that apply to what you can and can't eat? So he's going to try and create a sort of algebraic isomorphism between the one and the other, so he can give you a kind of formal structure of inedibility. And from there, he wants to go further. And he says, now that I have this sort of algebraic structure of what is edible and what is not edible, the relation between these two categories, he doesn't want to study what you eat and what you don't eat. He wants to study the relation. Right? You see what I'm driving at? It's a completely abstract, very different way of looking at anthropology. And he's going to say, even more interesting is the fact that once you get the structure of what you can eat, there's also a structure of cuisine, and a structure of table manners, and a structure for kinship, and a structure of all kinds of social activities. And then once he starts studying the relations that are embedded within these activities, he then starts to create structures between the structures, and this structure that emerges, that unifies all the various substructures, is literally the form, the structure of human consciousness. Right? In some ways, this harks back to the Kantian project of doing the transcendental deduction, looking at the perimeter of human consciousness and what can and cannot be known. In other words, like Kant's a priori forms of human cognition, the laws of structure, which are determined and discerned by structuralist anthropologists and psychologists, are assumed to be literally the constituting factors in our world. All right? So there are deep mental structures which we make public in our communicative behavior. Part of our communicative behavior, as de Saussure saw, was language. But other things like kinship, the way in which we identify our family, the way in which we eat, the way in which we express our table manners, are all communicative rule-governed structures. And this domain of culture, this domain of symbols, is what anthropology claims to study. So anthropology turns out to be a sort of universal discipline which is going to break the previously held bounds of anthropology. One way of summing up the difference between Malinowski and Lévi-Strauss, think about it this way. It's kind of a perverse way, but it encapsulates it nicely. Malinowski thinks that a dog is an animal. Lévi-Strauss thinks that a dog is a noun. Now, none of us would say that a dog isn't a noun or isn't an animal, but you're thinking about it in different ways. Lévi-Strauss wants to know how the category noun right, fits with the other categories we have, like how our category of what's eatable fits with our table manners, right? So, whereas the functionalists like Malinowski would look for the content. Why do we not eat the dog? Why do they not eat the pig? Why do these people not eat the cow? Lévi-Strauss brackets all those problems. Says, let's think about why it is people decide to create rules that you can't eat stuff that's good for you. What's going on there? What are they trying to tell us? What does it mean? So they're looking for meaning. Now, most of these big distinctions come out early in the history of structuralism with de Saussure's idea of language. And let's think about two ways of thinking about it, because this will connect with that dog as an animal and dog as a noun distinction. Let's think of speech. One way of thinking of speech is as stuff people do, and another way of thinking about it, a sort of rationalistic structural way, is as grammar and syntax. This will be analogous to games of chess. If you go to the park and you watch people playing chess, that's the kind of empirical way of approaching it. You could also get a book that holds the rules of chess, and that would be another way of thinking about it. The rules of chess, that's the structural, grammatical element. That's the atemporal, formal, synchronic element is the word that he uses, because it's all devoid of time. The rules of chess are timeless. On the other hand, the empirical way of looking at games of chess, of listening to people speak, of looking for the content diachronically in time, is the temporal, empirical way of doing that. The difference between the structuralists and the empiricists, or the structuralists and the functionalists, is one group, the empiricists, want to look at the message. The structuralists want to look at the code. All right? And they think that the code is so much more interesting and important than the message. In other words, once we figure out what the code is, we can go back and decode all the messages. That's not interesting. It's a much more abstract logical problem. All right? So that's what they're trying to accomplish anyway. And now can you see why it applies to so many disciplines? In other words, you could think of a set of algebraic structures in mathematics, and you would transform them by certain clearly defined rules into topological structures? Possible. Think about it in geology. You start out with a certain kind of crystal, you apply heat or pressure, and you transform it into a different kind of crystal. Precise mathematical rules. Now think about things like language. We get the basic elements of language, the phonemes, the parts of speech, and then according to certain grammatical rules, we construct declarative sentences. Get the idea? Well, now let's move from the realm of language to the whole realm of social activity, kinship and stuff like that. All right. Now, what Lévi-Strauss is going to try and do is continue the Cartesian project at the cultural level. He's going to investigate us as a kind of cultural collective self, because the myths and the language and the cultural rules that we have adopted as being part of our culture determine, literally in the strict Kantian sense, limit the way in which we experience the world. Right? So we experience the world through the formality, the rule-governed behaviors of our language, not just the language of speech, but also the language of our culture as a whole, all our symbolic rule-governed behavior. Now, what we get out of this is an attempt to find the unalterable source of all human communicative activity. It all seems to come from some one thing that is the underlying substratum to all cultures. In other words, Lévi-Strauss is trying to look for the common structures that connect us with people who are hunter-gatherers. In other words, they're going to generate a certain set of myths, and so are we. They will be responding to a certain set of stimuli, and so will we. But what both we and the hunter-gatherers are structural transformations of the same human psyche. Doesn't change over time. Also, can you see the static ahistorical, atemporal element of this? It's all the same. That's what it means to be diachronic and grammatical rather than historical and empirical. And that's also one of the big objections to this kind of anthropology. Now, when Lévi-Strauss talks about his method, here's what he actually says he does. And I come to this second after Piaget, because Piaget is more transparent, a little easier to comprehend. But what Lévi-Strauss says is this. First of all, if you want to do something structurally, if you want to investigate a thing structurally, first thing you do is define the phenomenon as a relation between two or more terms, real or supposed. Now, first of all, he doesn't say go look at the world. He says define your terms. What is more rationalistic and Cartesian than that? So where does it start? With a definition? Right, it's completely self-contained. Second thing you do, you create a system of ordered, of a table of possible permutations. For example, suppose you want to study kinship. Well, and you take the basic units of kinship, mother, father, son, daughter, whatever it is you take to be the minimal units of analysis, and then make an algebraic table of all possible permutations. It's algebra, it's math. And then after you do that, you take this table as your general object of analysis. So Malinowski and those empirical anthropologists are out there looking at savages, looking at people that are hunter-gatherers, and trying to see how they behave and what they do. Claude Lévi-Strauss is back at his office with his algebraic table of permutations for all possible kinship systems and says, I'm going to study this. And then if you empirical guys happen to find things that correspond to this, well, first of all, you can't help but find things that correspond to this because it's all possible permutations. And if you don't find things that correspond to this, that shows just the fact that, well, there's still options open to us. Right? We live within the domain of logic and mathematics, but that comes first for these guys. So we take this table as a general object of our analysis. We're studying the possible logical permutations of things like kinship, cuisine, all that sort of business. And now within the realm of just structure, not just as method, but once we have this structure put together, we find that it is systemic, that it is the product of ordered transformations, because you've got to remember that these guys live in the empirical world of space and time and change, but they have this Cartesian Platonic yearning, so they have to find some way to turn the stuff that moves and changes into this formal structure. And that's why we need rules for transformation. Transformation can be mathematical, as we do in algebra. The transformation can be grammatical, as we do in language, but the transformation can be concrete, like we do in social life. It's kind of a peculiar idea. You wouldn't have thought to extend the idea of rule-governed behaviors quite this far. Now, for de Saussure, all of culture was encoded in language. For Lévi-Strauss, all of culture is going to be seen as a field of languages, of subdialects that gesture upward towards the big Ur-stuff of a whole culture, the big Ur language. And that language suggests that there's a fundamental set of structures within the human mind. That's where the Kantian a priori ideas of human cognition come in. Now, what does this mean? He's going to construct something like a linguistics of human culture, a linguistics of action. How weird. Who would have thought this up? It takes a long time of abstracting to have thought of something like this. And what he's going to argue is that kinship, clothing, food, exchange, mythology are all symbolic structures, crypto-linguistic manifestations of an invariant substructure. All right? And this comes out very nicely in his work, and it's easier if I give you some examples, which will make it a little bit easier. Start with the beginning. When we go to a restaurant, we have rules for cuisine. I know that you may not immediately recognize that, but in fact, we certainly do. Imagine what would happen if you went in and ordered dessert first. Well, I mean, they would probably bring it to you, but the waiter would look at you kind of funny, like, that's an odd thing. I'd like dessert, and then I'd like a steak. And then I'd like my salad. That's very odd. In other words, what we're doing there is inverting the grammar of our cuisine. We're not constructing a grammatical sentence, and that's why people will look at you funny. All right? In other words, think about the fact that in the German language, right, the verbs usually come at the end. If you put your verbs at the beginning, people that speak German are going to look at you like, well, that's a very peculiar way of communicating with me. Right? Well, suppose you decide to put your dessert first at the beginning of your meal. Well, do you see how it is analogous to putting your verb at the end of the language, where he's interested in parts of speech? So there's a sort of code, there's a set of rules by which we construct meals. All right? And what he's saying is that not only do meals work that way, but kinship works that way, patterns of exchange work that way. In other words, they're all rule-governed, and all these rules gesture at one big set of rules, and that gestures at the ultimate rules which govern human consciousness. It's a deep and kind of weird argument. It's a hard thing to think through, but there's a lot to this. Let me give you examples. Because he's going to say that not only are we going to find these algebraic structures within things like kinship and food and cuisine and table manners, but there are what a mathematician would call homologies between them. All right? One is connected to the other. For example, there's a special kind of meal and a special kind of cuisine that we serve at weddings. And we seat the people in special ways. We put the bride and groom up on a dais so they can watch everybody, right, and things like that. And this is a way, and this organization of a meal is connected with our construction of a kinship system. Right? So we go through a set of rituals, and this ritual is and these rituals are rule governed, but the way in which we construct our meal is rule governed. For example, there has to be a point at which the bride and groom cut the cake. What would a wedding be without that? It would be very strange. Well, why? Because it's governed by a certain grammar of behavior, and we would think it peculiar if they didn't. We seat them in certain ways. In other words, these systems of rules are homologous to one another, so you can make connections across them. If you don't know the rules of a culture, you are going to be seen as lacking a way of communicating with people. Let me give you an example. When I was a boy, once I made a great breakthrough in cuisine. I made chocolate and jelly sandwiches. My mother was not looking, and I made chocolate and jelly sandwiches. Now, nowadays, I would never eat a chocolate and jelly sandwich, and neither would you. But I was 5 at the time, and I hadn't learned the grammar of cuisine for this culture, so I didn't know that you couldn't make a sandwich of chocolate and jelly. It struck me as a great idea. And any 5-year-old you talk to that doesn't know the grammar of our culture will say, yeah, that's a great idea, right? Because it's sweet and it's nice. But I look at it now, and I wouldn't eat that in a million years. I might eat a piece of chocolate, and then a little later on, eat a piece of bread. but I wouldn't violate the grammar. In other words, what I was doing there in constructing chocolate and jelly sandwiches was gastronomic baby talk. That's a really interesting way of thinking about that, and there's a certain truth to it. In other words, yeah, that's probably right. And not only is that true for the way in which we eat, it's true for many of the things, of the structures which inform and govern our social life. So it's an interesting idea. There is a sort of grammar to food which you might not have guessed. Right? Try ordering dog in a restaurant. Now, Lévi-Strauss's first and most, or one of the most, the work that brought him the most immediate notoriety was called The Elementary Structures of Kinship. And you can see what this is going to be like, right? He first was going to reduce kinship to its parts of speech, to its phonemes, to the minimum units of it. He doesn't want to look empirically at how people construct kinship systems, although he does, do that in the course of his career. What he's interested now is the minimal units of kinship, which are mother, sister, father, and son. And not the things, rather the relations. In other words, your mother isn't the person that gave you birth. Your mother is the person to whom you relate, with whom you have the mother relation, regardless of whether she's your biological mother or not. It's a series of relations between people. All right? So then he works out, as he says, all the algebraic structure of all the possible permutations, and then gives you a way of transforming these structures one into another. And he says, look, this is what kinship is. This is all kinship ever could possibly be. And now all you functionalist anthropologists can go out into the field, right, and get dirty and find out what particular groups of people have what particular permutation. But that's all it can possibly be. At least if we're going to study kinship on its own as a self-contained substructure within the whole social structure. Now, after the elementary structures of kinship, which is in 49, he produces a number of essays about the theory of structural anthropology in the 50s, and then probably his most famous book, and it's a real wonderful book. Those of you who are hoping to read a little structuralism in the future, it's called The Savage Mind. It's published in 62. It's a wonderful book. It's a very interesting book, and it's a real headbend, and this is quite a difficult piece of work. And what he says there is that it's possible to view the thinking of human beings at the primitive kind of hunting-gathering level, what he calls the savage level, as being not different, not fundamentally changed from the kind of thinking that we do. In other words, what he's going to try and say is that there's a unity to the human mind and human reason, and savages participate in the same mind and reason that we do. And in fact, what they do is just transform the world symbolically in the same way that we do. It's just that their logic is concrete as opposed to abstract like ours. It's not worse, it's not inferior, it's just organized around a different grammar. Now, this is very important for the following reason. Anthropologists for a long time have been kind of wedded to the idea, committed to the idea of cultural relativism, right? That one culture is as good as another. And that it's been hard to sell this idea, particularly to technologically advanced, first world countries. And Lévi-Strauss gives us a new take on that, which is kind of nice. In some ways, it's a sort of neo-Rousseauian idea of the noble savage, or at least of the equality of savage life and civilized life, whatever that is. And what he says is something like this. Since a cultural system is a kind of a grammar, a set of rules for constructing and connecting different elements, well, asking what culture is the best one is just like asking what's the best grammar or what's the best language. The question is stupid, doesn't make any sense. What is the best language? Well, what is the best language for what purpose? Maybe I can see how some languages might serve different purposes better. But if you don't tell me what purposes you're trying to serve, and you just ask me what's the best grammar, well, the idea doesn't make any sense. There's nothing to say to that. To assume that my grammar is the best one is just the most obvious and unpleasant kind of cultural chauvinism. What he's saying is that since your culture is a set of rules, a sort of a grammar, to say that your culture is better than another one means that it's arbitrary, and it's just a way of inflating your own ego. So what he's trying to do then is give some new twist to the Rousseauian idea that human beings or human cultures at an earlier stage of development are not fundamentally different or fundamentally inferior from technologically sophisticated cultures. Right? I think it's been one of the main concerns of anthropology in this century. A good example of his thinking is in the little book that he published in 62 on totemism. And totemism is the following. It's the tendency to identify groups or subgroups with animal species. So, for example, if you look at a group of Indians, the tribe may break up into, say, 6 or 8 clans, and the clans will be the bear clan and the snake clan and the zebra clan and the lion clan, things like that. Now, when a primitive person says to you, "We are the lion people, and I am the descendant of a lion," it is tempting for kind of cultural chauvinists to say, well, that shows the primitive childlike nature of savages, be kind of indulgent and patronizing. Lévi-Strauss doesn't like that. And Malinowski might say, well, for him to call himself the lion people, that serves some function in their society, so that's why he calls himself a lion. What Lévi-Strauss says is, no, look, this guy isn't stupid. He doesn't believe he's a lion. What he's doing is taking something that you understand to be a metaphor and treating it as a metonym. In other words, he's treating it as a concrete kind of reasoning which only appears on the surface structure to be metaphorical, and in fact it is metonymic and perfectly logical. So what he is saying is that, and this connects back to the savage mind, that those who create these ideas like totemism, like mythology in particular, because that's one of his main concerns, to show that all myths are structural transformations of the same thing again and again and again in different contexts. What happens under these circumstances is that Lévi-Strauss is trying to drive at the idea that within a given culture, the construction of myths is the essential poetic and also the essential conceptual activity, and that myths have a deep structure which are isomorphic to nature. In other words, what we are doing when we create, say, totemism within a society, we are creating certain statements about our structural relations. Lévi-Strauss's reading is something like this. If I say that I am a man from the lion clan, and this person over here says that he's a man from the bear clan, I'm not saying that I'm a lion, he's a bear. Lévi-Strauss says, no, what that is a metonym which expresses certain structural similarities in our relations. Suppose these clans are exogamous. So what that means is that when I say that I am a lion, that means I must marry someone outside the lion clan. That's not a metaphorical statement. That's a real structural statement about my relations within the kinship system. When he says that he's a bear man, a man of the bear clan, what that means is that he's not allowed to marry any bear women. This is not nonsensical. This is not metaphorical or childish. This is a transformation of certain structural relations, our kinship system. What had appeared to be primitive turns out not to be primitive, turns out to be quite deep. The idea that he introduces is bricolage and the bricoleur. The bricoleur is the totem maker. The bricoleur is the person that makes this abstract logic, that makes these myths. The bricoleur constructs totemic messages in which nature mirrors culture. Bricolage is our ability to construct this abstract, concrete as opposed to abstract logic. Now, his most famous contributions have been in the interpretation of myths. Lévi-Strauss and his structural interpretation of mythology suggests that all myths can be translated into certain regularly recurring structures. In this respect, it harks back to Freud. Freud on dreams is very much like Lévi-Strauss on myth. What Freud says is, yeah, I know one person dreams of a shark, another dreams of a dragon, another dreams of a cave, another dreams of a tree, but regardless of what the content of your dream is, it all structurally corresponds to certain essential and necessary elements in your psyche. Well, move that from the individual level to the cultural level. Myths are generated, and they tell you different things, that Jesus died on the cross, or that Apollo drives his chariot through the sky, and all kinds of stuff. But regardless of what the content is, Lévi-Strauss says that it has a common structure which describes the social world and the natural world. What it does, though, is describe it in a sort of code. Lévi-Strauss thinks that structuralism discerns this code, gives us a mathematical expression for it. And what appeared to be heterogeneous turns out to be unified, and we kind of achieve that goal of finding a substratum which stays the way it is, logically accessible to all rational people. Now, sort of difficulties do we encounter in thinking about the world like this? And I mean, there are quite a few. And before I take that any further, let me finish off with this last book. I won't quite go to that. Last thing that he does is, I think, perhaps his greatest work. It's 4 volumes. Gets published between 68 and 74, 64 and 78, something like that. And the main theme, and the book is called Introduction to the Science of Mythology. It's a multi-volume work. And what he offers us is, in the first volume, The Raw and the Cooked, a way of looking at the way in which we prepare food and the table manners that we have as being structurally determined by certain sorts of laws. And then he tries to find homologies between these sets of structures, the structures of our table manners and our cuisine and our kinship system and our language, and the way in which we organize the dispersal of political power, that kind of thing. So all these structures turn out to be homologous, or that's what he's looking for. And what this argues for is the unity of consciousness, thought, and reason across cultural determinations. And in that respect, it's an attempt, like that of Freud, not to create a science of society, because I think that's an overblown claim, but what it does is create a sort of hermeneutic, a set of principles by which we interpret these symbolic data that we get from cultures. And the difficulty with this hermeneutic, this structuralist interpretation of anthropology, is the same that we get with the hermeneutics involved in Freudian psychiatry. Hermeneutics is not univocal. Right? It's multivocal. There are a number of possible interpretive strategies we might use. Structuralism is one among many. It is clear enough that Lévi-Strauss doesn't want that. He wants it to be the science of anthropology. He doesn't want it to be a hermeneutic, but I don't think he can quite make that claim. He doesn't get away with that. It is a certain way, a pattern or strategy by which we approach cultural phenomena. Now, there are some problems that come into this. First problem that comes to mind. In the overture, or the introduction to that book, The Raw and the Cooked, he says that science, too, is a kind of mythology. And of course, what else can he believe? If you believe that all our conceptual structures are basically transformations of the same one thing, and you go for cultural relativism, then our scientific constructions, like structuralism itself, one assumes, never get beyond or outside the pale of myth. Now, one wonders, under those circumstances, how science or knowledge is possible at all, or at least how a non-mythological science is possible. And if it isn't possible, then isn't there some sort of reflexive ambiguity which undermines our attempt, right, to unify all conceptual structures under one rubric? That's one problem. A second difficulty that we're going to get is that it might be argued that, cultural relativism is internally incoherent. For example, what's more provincial, what's more Western than the idea of cultural relativism? Imperial China, they thought that they were the Middle Kingdom. They thought they were the center of the world, and they didn't believe in cultural relativism. Does cultural relativism tell me that they were wrong? It's just a transformation of a structure. One assumes the same structure. So apparently the transformations of these structures lead us to contradictory conclusions. One wonders how mathematics can do that. This is real fishy. Beyond that, we have some other difficulties. There are, particularly in his latest work, The Raw and the Cooked, Procrustean, apparently arbitrary distinctions that get made, oppositions that aren't clearly justified. For example, Lévi-Strauss thinks that the opposite of honey is tobacco. I have no idea why. I mean, I've read the book a great many times, and I don't know why. Also, boiled potatoes on our table, that's the inverse of roast beef. Well, I mean, I guess maybe it is. I just don't know why. I mean, I'll take your word for it. In some ways, it's like in Freud's theory, why is it the unknown stranger in all your dreams? Why is it always your father? Because Professor Freud says so. Why are your potatoes, or your boiled potatoes, the opposite of your roasted beef? Because Professor Lévi-Strauss says so. It becomes kind of trying after a while. A more important observation is that this is essentially ahistorical. And Piaget points this out. He has, in that respect, the same problem that Freud has. How is it that these structures of the mind are generated over time? Why is it that they don't seem to develop over time? They seem to be constant both for us and the savages. One assumes that the amoebas and that the great apes in the process of evolution didn't have these structures. When did we, human beings, start having them? And how? Structuralism can't tell you about that because it's so ahistorical. Right? That's going to be one of the big problems that we encounter here. In many respects, in the 20th century, the problems of philosophy have been translated into the problems of social science. The difference between Malinowski and Lévi-Strauss, the difference between Hume and Kant. In some ways, the difference between Aristotle and Plato. Right? It's the same thing reformulated and put into a different domain, a different context. This is the rationalist variant of that. The advantages of this is that it gives you new and interesting ways of looking at culture. In other words, I think that we shouldn't be too critical of them. I would never have thought that there was a grammar to cuisine. But after thinking about it, yeah, I can see that there is a certain set of rules to our kinship and to our eating and to things like that. And that you might see them as being rule-governed, and that there might be some advantage in abstracting these rules in a sort of logical calculus. Okay, it allows you to make comparisons. That might be useful. The difficulty here is that this threatens to turn into a sterile series of tautologies, in which you just insist that X is transformed into Y without giving any grounds for belief that X is Y, that honey is the analog of tobacco, or that honey is the inverse of tobacco. I don't see why. The difficulty that we have may be thought of this way, and here's where I bring in the ghost of Descartes, the Cartesian tradition. In Descartes and his theory of the mind, we had a problem, not in finding out about ourselves, you just look inward and you know yourself, but in finding out about other minds. In other words, you see behavior in the world, but what grounds do you have for believing that there are other minds, or for believing that you can possibly know them? The ground is very shaky. Descartes always has problems with this. Well, Lévi-Strauss has a similar kind of a problem. In his system, the problem of knowing other minds is structurally transformed into the problem of knowing other cultures. right? And in both cases, it results in the same thing. Certain kinds of logical impasses and implausible dogmatic references which suggest that he's reached the end of his tether, he's taken this method as far as it can possibly go. And in that respect, I'd be inclined to say that the structuralist method is essentially a failure. If what we mean by structuralism is an attempt to find an Urstoff, a sort of set of algebraic relations that underlies all of social reality, I think it hasn't done that, and I don't think it's likely to do that. What it is useful for is as a hermeneutic, as a sort of heuristic device by which to look at cultures, formulate the relations within a culture, and make cross-cultural comparisons that one wouldn't have thought of to make before.